Well, we are just starting, so I'm glad to greet everyone on our second session today. And our first speaker is Irina Burukina from MT Research Institute for Linguistics and Ethos Laurent University. And her talk is about embedded C, which projects an argument.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you. So I will talk about in Mari, which is a Uralic language. And I guess it is already well known in the literature that spec-CP in some languages at least exhibit these A properties. So for example, it can be involved in case assignment. And I will try to persuade you that in this Mari language, it can also be involved in theta role assignment. So that a particular type of C head in Mari can thematically license an argument which is merged originally in the specified position of the embedded CP. Okay, and I will mostly show you data from middle Mari, but I will also show you a couple of examples from Hill Mari. And so far I found no difference between the two languages when it comes to this particular construction that I will be talking about. So I will talk about embedded clauses under speech-act verbs. And just as in Russian, Mari speech-act verbs can serve as mandative predicates when they embed an infinitival or a subjunctive clause. So when they embed a finite indicative clause, we get a simple utterance. But when they embed a finite subjunctive or a non-finite clause, then we suddenly get an order. And you can see an example here in 3. So we have here the speech-act verb kalasash, to tell. And Mari is a head final language, so the lexical verb is always going to be at the right age of a clause. And this lexical verb, it takes a dative dependent, the addressee, Melanna, and it also embeds this non-finite clause with an optional complementizer manen. And so the reading here is Masha told us to come, which is an order basically, so we should come. And the dative DP here is interpreted simultaneously as the addressee, the goal of communication, and the mandi. So this is very similar to what we see in Russian, for example, or in Hungarian, which is another Uralic language. But unlike Russian and Hungarian, Mari also allows us to have two unrelated dative dependents. And you can see it in 4. So I can also say Masha mlam tlanet talashman and kalasen, which means Masha told me that you should come. So we have here two datives which are not co-referenced. The blue one, which I will color code in blue, is interpreted as the immediate addressee, and the red one is interpreted as the mandi, the one who should do something. So we sort of split these two roles and assign them to two different dative dependents in this case. And the question is, of course, how do we analyze such examples? So the first intuition may be that, well, the blue dative DP is in fact just an adjunct. So the red one is the proper addressee, similarly to the green one in single dative construction, and the blue one is just this intermediary optional dependent. However, apparently this is not the case. So the first dative DP is restricted to plus animate and regular plus human intermediaries. So I cannot say, for example, Masha Shesherlan, Masha Sereshlan Milam Tolashman and Kalasen, like Masha told me to come via a letter, or Masha told me to come through a letter. This is ungrammatical. And also such double datives are prohibited with embedded finite clauses, for instance. So if both dative DPs are in the matrix clause, then why would one of them suddenly disappear when we embed a finite clause instead of a non-finite clause, right? So this is not what we expect. And also it is interesting that this first dative DP doesn't actually have to be dative. So there are a couple of speech-act verbs that select an accusative addressee for some reason. And one of them is surveillance, and surveillance can also appear in such constructions, only that there we won't see two datives, we will see one accusative, one dative. So I can either say, Masha yumum tolashman and surveillance, Masha begged God to come, and God must be accusative. Or I can also say, Masha yumum melanna tolashman and surveillance. Masha begged God that we should come. So we are the mandi in this case, and God is still the addressee. So at this point, it may be suggested that, well, the blue dative DP is in fact the matrix addressee, and the red one, well, maybe it is just the embedded subject, because we know that in some languages we can have overt embedded subjects and non-finite clauses, right? And this is partially supported by the fact that, for example, the second dative DP and the non-finite clause apparently form a constituent together. So I will skip the example. I will just go through the facts very quickly. So the two, for example, they cannot be separated by a matrix adverb. And also the second dative, the red one, and the non-finite clause can only be dislocated together. So they seem to be this like single constituent that excludes the matrix predicate and the first dative DP, for example. But I would like to argue against erasing analysis, for instance, and against an overt embedded subject analysis, because, well, DP dative does not look like an overt embedded subject. First of all, it is restricted, and it must obey this plus human restriction, regardless of the embedded predicate. So in principle, I can take a finite clause with a non-human subject and embed it under a speech-act verb and get this order interpretation. So examples like 10b are grammatical. Masha told me that the cow should come herself. This is fine, this is perfect. But if I try to do the same with a non-finite clause, this is suddenly ungrammatical. Or rather, I don't have the intended reading. So I cannot say Masha Melanim with this embedded non-finite clause. I can only have a plus human nominal as this red dative DP. And in addition to this, these constructions do not pass the idiom chunk test. So again, if the red dative DP is just the embedded subject, then I would expect it to be able to pass the idiom chunk test. And it does not. And finally, these double dative constructions are restricted to speech-act verbs. So again, if I can have embedded overt subjects in this language, right, in non-finite clauses, why don't I see them more often with other predicates as well? Why are they restricted to these speech-act verb constructions? So let me quickly summarize what I've just said. So first, we have found out that the first dative DP, the blue one, is apparently a true matrix addressee. And we also found that the second dative DP, on the one hand, is related to the non-finite clause. They form a constituent together. But on the other hand, it cannot be analyzed as an argument of the embedded predicate itself. So the raising analysis, in my opinion at least, is excluded here. So the structure that I propose can be summarized as the 1 in 12. So we have this XP, right, this unknown yet constituent formed by the dative DP in the embedded clause, right? In the embedded clause, we have this pro subject, which is co-index, which is controlled by the second dative DP, right? And then this whole XP, this constituent, is selected as the complement of the matrix speech-act verb C. So again, Mari is a head final language, so all heads are on the right side in the structures. And specifically, I argue that this X here, this head that combines the dative DP and the embedded clause together, is actually the C head of the embedded clause. Okay? And it is a C head of a particular type. So in Mari, it is manifested as the complementizer manen, or its null element. So manen can be optionally covered. And you can see it's schematized in 13. So we have Masha, Milanna, Petelan, Tolash, Manen, Kalasen. So I argue that Kalasen selects this CP as its complement. And within the CP, the specifier position is occupied by the dative DP, Petelan. Then the complement of the C head is the non-finite IP with the pro subject. Control is established between the dative DP and the pro subject. And manen is this optionally covert, optionally overt complementizer. Yes, thank you so much for the 10-minute notification. So this analysis immediately allows us to explain this very nice correlation that we see in Mari. So only those predicates that can embed a non-finite complement clause with the complementizer manen allow double dative construction. So for example, we also have predicates like nele, heart. I apologize for misalignment here. So we have predicates like nele, we have models which also embed non-finite clauses. They also have dative dependence, but they cannot embed a non-finite clause with the complementizer manen, and they do not allow to have two dative dependents simultaneously. So we have this nice correlation. We see manen, we can't have two datives. We don't see manen, we can't have two datives. And let me now say a couple of more words about this complementizer manen. So I suggest that its exceptional status, so why is it such a complementizer that can introduce an argument, right? So its exceptional status can be explained by the fact that manen, in fact, is a semi-grammaticalized element. And it is diachronically derived from the speech-act verb manash, say or tell. And morphologically, manen is in fact identical to either a converb manen or this past third-person singular form manen. And you can see actually an example in 15 where we still have manen functioning as this lexical verb, right? So, ala virus, manen chirurg. The surgeon said, blah, blah, blah. And here manen is basically a lexical verb. So similarly to lexical predicates, for example, and unlike proper complementizers borrowed to Hill-Murray from Russian, manen, for example, still must appear at the right edge of the embedded clause. So it still exhibits some properties of this lexical predicate, right? So you can see it here in 16a, we have this borrowed complementizer чтобы, which appears at the left edge of the embedded clause. And in 16b, we have an identical sentence with the embedded complementizer manen, and that one appears at the right edge of the embedded clause, just like a lexical verb. So at this point, it may be proposed that, well, maybe manen in these sentences under consideration is also a lexical predicate. Maybe it's just a converb. And so what we have is something like, Mary spoke to us saying for Peter to come, for example. So this manen is something like saying, right, the converb. However, apparently this is also not the case. So first, we know that converb clauses in Murray are usually adjuncts, and these embedded clauses with manen are complements. I will skip the discussion here. You can ask me about it during the Q&A time. Second, we also know that the morphological form of manen in such constructions, in double dative constructions, is fixed. So for example, I cannot create a negative converb out of that, although in principle with the lexical verb it should be possible. Thirdly, manen cannot be substituted by a converb form of a synonymous speech-act verb. So I can have manen as my complementizer, but I can't have, let's say, popin or kutiren, right? Which is semantically also speech-act verbs like to speak and to say, but they have not been grammaticalized into complementizers. And finally, manen in general as a complementizer is it lost its semantics, at least partially. So for example, it can be used with verbs like believe or know, so not only in speech act context. So this all allows me to propose that, following Toldova and Septoborska, that manen is currently being grammaticalized as a functional element, but that it is still somewhere in the middle of this grammaticalization journey, basically. So it may still retain some properties of the lexical speech act verb. And one of those properties is the ability to combine with a non-finite clausal complement to assign dative case, and crucially to license the addressee argument, right? So as a complementizer, manen sits in the C-hat position, but as a semi-grammaticalized complementizer, manen can still project an argument in the specifier position and combine that argument with the non-finite clause in its complement position. And now very quickly, finally, I would like to show you just some nicely looking tree structures. So essentially, to formally analyze these constructions, I adopt this oligophoric control analysis proposed by Landau for attitude predicates. And attitude predicates include our speech act verbs, for example. So what we see here, we have the lexical verb that selects this CP as its complement, right? Within the CP, we have manen in the C position, and then we have this embedded fin P, or you can think about as the embedded IP, for example. It depends on a particular approach, within which we have the pro subject, right? So if we have only one dative DP, we have only the matrix addressee, right? In that case, Landau's analysis suggests that In the specifier position of the CP, we have the so-called concept generator phrase, which introduces the coordinates that relate the embedded proposition to the broader context. So we have there the coordinates like the author, the addressee, the time, and the world. And in this case, the addressee coordinate is the one crucial for us. So according to Landau, it is introduced in the spec CP as this silent pronoun. The pronoun gets bound by the matrix addressee, right? And then the pronoun itself is in this predication relation with the embedded FinP, right? So this is Landau's analysis. This is not the original, this is not my original proposal. What I suggest is that we can take this structure and we can just slightly adapt it to account for our double dative constructions as well. The only difference is that here, instead of this discourse coordinate in spec CP, we have the real second dative DP introduced. Right, so Manin has this power to project an argument. And this argument is essentially it replaces the addressee coordinate that we normally would expect to see in logophoric control. So when we have one dative, we have no argument projected in spec CP, and we have this discourse coordinate introduced covertly. When we have two dative DPs, we have the second dative DP introduced in the spec CP and replacing this discourse coordinate essentially. And again, the second dative and the embedded FinP are related via predication. So this is essentially my proposal. And I would be very grateful for all comments and suggestions. And if we have time during the Q&A session, I can talk a little bit about the alternative analysis, which in my opinion does not work. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Irina, and thank you for keeping in time. We have some 9 to 10 minutes for discussions. Questions, please.
Question in chat. Alexei Kozlov.
Okay, Alexei.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. It's only that it was maybe too fast for me. I wanted to ask, why not analyze? Why do you analyze this argument as specifically CP argument? For example, you know that in your embedded clauses there is some modality flavor, right? And that means that you have a modal operator in the TP zone, and of course it is natural for modal operators to be control predicates, and these can be the source of your animus restriction. So why CP and not, for example, some mod P in the somewhere lower?
Yes, thank you so much for this question. So I thought about this option. I considered, in fact, two options. First, that the embedded clause and the second dative are connected by some hidden model, right, as you just said, or that they may be connected by some hidden speech-act verb, for example. The only thing that prohibits me currently to propose either of this analysis is that I don't want just to invent a new model. So I want this silent model to behave as overt models in Mari. And there are some mismatches in their behavior. So I don't want to, I'm afraid I don't have time to go into detail, but overt models have other restrictions on the dative DP, for example. So overt models don't have plus human restrictions. They have something like plus animate restriction, and some speakers, in fact, allow their like even inanimate dative DPs with normal models, like, for example, model need or model must, right? And with the silent model, we have this plus human restriction. So this is one thing, for instance. Also, there is some discrepancy going on with the idioms, for example. So again, I can propose this model analysis, but in that case, I would have to postulate some brand new silent model for Mari, and I'm not sure that I want to do that.
Next question, Mark Baker, please.
Thank you. Yep, I enjoyed your presentation. I like the analysis. I think it was well argued for. I have a question about the slightly broader context. So I was just curious whether mana could also be a complementizer with finite clauses as well as the non-finite ones. And if so, if you also got the extra dative with the finite clause, you seem to imply no. If not, why not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so first, thank you so much for the question. So yes, monin can be used as a complementizer in embedded finite clauses, actually with the very same speech act verbs. So when they embed a finite subjunctive clause, we can see monin there in a finite subjunctive clause. So that's one story. The second fact is that embedded finite clauses are incompatible with two datives. So when we have an embedded finite clause, we can only have one dative. I explained that so I believe that the reason is that when we have an embedded finite clause, it cannot serve as a predicate. And we must establish predication relation between the dative DP and the embedded clause. So monin forms a complex predicate, if you want, with the embedded FinP or the embedded TP. So it must contain this unsaturated pro variable, essentially. And if it's already finite, if it's already saturated, then monin does not have enough power, basically. So it's a bit of maybe hand waving, because I'm using this term like semi-grammaticalized to explain many properties of monin, but that's the story I can currently propose.
Yeah, just to follow up, I think that's an interesting fact and so on. The one thing is it might undermine a little bit your claim that the second dative gets a theta roll from the head. Because if it has a theta roll, then you might expect it to be independent. Whereas if it doesn't have a theta roll, then it might need to be the semantic relationship.
But we also know, I think, in other languages that sometimes, again, we have like arguments introduced jointly by this like complex predicate, right? So for example, I need to say that monin assigns a theta roll, for example, because I need to explain this semantic restriction, right? And it's very nice that monin is essentially, that it used to be a speech act predicate, and the restriction is just the one that we see for addressees, for example, right? But on the other hand, we can still say that, well, we do know that, for example, let's say the external argument theta roll, right? So it is assigned by little v. Is it assigned by the combination of little v and the big VP, for example, right? So it is assigned by this complex predicate, essentially, formed by something that looks like a functional head and a lexical component, right? So maybe I can develop this story into something similar with monin.
Thank you. Next question, Pavel Rudnev. Well,
you're muted. Sorry.
Yep, not anymore. Not anymore. Okay, so I really liked the way that your analysis captures the facts, but I'm afraid that it also plays merry hell with the tripartite, let's say, structure of the clause, the VP domain, the TP domain, and the CP domain, because now we are losing all the generalizations regarding the places where arguments can be introduced. Right? It's normally all the event participants are introduced while the event is being constructed. Let's say take Ramchand's approach to complex predicates, for example. You have lots of little v heads projection specifiers where that can be filled by multiple MPs, sometimes related by movement. But then once you've constructed your little VP, init P, whatever, res P, prop P, you existentially close off everything, and that's it. No more arguments can be introduced. And we know that the T doesn't introduce an argument, and in fact, no other head literally introduces an argument, right? So what do you have to say about this? Thanks.
Yeah, so I used to worry about this a lot, but then like the only thought that can comfort me right now is that we are dealing with an addressee here. And that's why on that very last slide, I had this like very tentatively formulated story about this dative DP basically replacing the discus coordinate that we would have otherwise. So we know that in embedded clauses in CPs embedded under attitude predicates especially, we do have discus coordinates. And we do know about those analyses that suggest that those coordinates are syntactically projected. And we also know that there are some analyses where those coordinates are, for example, pronouns, right? For some languages, it has been proposed. So maybe I can relate my story to this story and say that, well, here, this addressee actually can be introduced, and it has something to do because it essentially replaces that discourse coordinate. Of course, I have to think about predictions here.
Right, but just to follow up very quickly, and then I'm.
Sorry, we have one more question and comment, so please be short.
It's very quick. I'm afraid this makes your analysis very, very fragile because we don't really know that coordinates are projected in the syntax. There are analyses that argue that, but they can be wrong. And if they're wrong, so is your analysis.
That's for sure, yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's it.
Thank you.
Mark, do you have a second question or comment? Oh, sorry, I just mistook your raised hand.
I was just checking the protocols.
Okay. Sorry, Pavel, would you like to expand your point of view, to add some comment?
Oh, no, but Alexei Kozlov had a question, another question.
Alexei had a question, sorry, Alyosha.
It is in a more empirical vein. So at least in Hill-Murray, as far as I know, and I think in Meadow-Murray too, but I'm 100% sure for Hill-Murray, those dative subjects are also licensed in adjunct rationale clauses headed by the same monon. And what's I think more important for your analysis, in independent, like in clauses headed by non-finite forms in Mala and Shush with some necessitative meaning. Do you think that your current analysis captures those facts as well?
I have to do some hand waving here, but again, if we believe in this general story that we have this grammaticalization path for monon, right? So it goes from the purely lexical verb to the purely functional complementizer, right? And so on this path, it has like several stages with several properties corresponding to each stage. So when it's embedded under the speech act predicate, it's semi-grammaticalized, it can assign role and it can assign dative case. Then when it is a complementizer in a rationale clause, it can no longer assign theta role, but it can still assign case. And in fact, we know that complementizers, thankfully, we know that from other languages that C-heads can assign cases, right? We know that especially Landau proposed that like in Russian, the C-head can assign dative case exactly as in Hill-Murray, for example, what looks like. And for those rationale clause, especially, it's a bit easier because there, if I remember correctly, this dative component is apparently the embedded subject itself. So it is not semantically restricted, it passed idiom chunks test. So it is just the embedded subject that gets this dative case from the C-head. Of course, we have to explain like why and how, but that's an easier question in my opinion, at least.
Thank you, Irina. Thank you, everybody, for the discussion. We have to thank the participants.